Digital nomad visas are getting a lot of press these days, and if you are a newly remote worker with the ability to work from anywhere in the world, the idea of having a residence permit that allows you to spend anywhere from 6 months to 5 years in one place might seem pretty appealing. But wait a second, today I'm going to share with you the pros and cons of digital nomad visas. So I've been living a nomadic lifestyle for a long time now, and I've seen that in different iterations where for a couple of years I lived a fully perpetual traveler lifestyle where I would just go from country to country, often in sequence, i.e. you'd move from Southeast Asia from one country to the next, or from Eastern Europe one country to the next, and you drag a suitcase behind you. There was a good amount of that time where I had a fixed base, originally in the United States, then I sold that house. Later that base was in Malaysia, where you would just keep stuff and you would refuel. There was a brief period of time where my stuff was in storage and I had no fixed base. Today I happen to be much more focused on places where I own homes, places where I hold either citizenship or residence permits, and so life is a little bit more certain. And I'm going to talk about how the nomadic lifestyle has progressed since I started. I want to talk about the pros and cons specifically of digital nomad visas and why you may or may not want that, or you may want some kind of alternative. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce their taxes, diversify and protect their assets, and yes, hold residence permits, citizenships, and other tools to increase their optionality in an increasingly changing world. We also host Nomad Capitalist Live. It's the biggest and best offshore event, and it's open to everybody, 7 or 8 figures or no. So let's talk about pros and cons of digital nomad visas, because if you are a remote worker, if you're a freelancer, if you have a small business, you might have been looking at how this can help you. You also might be someone who runs a business that is remote, and you have remote staff, and they're talking to you about digital nomad visas, and you're debating like, hey, how is that going to affect my business? Let's talk about what a digital nomad visa is. It is not, as I indicated in the intro, technically a residence permit. What it does is it is a longer stay visa. And so where Indonesia is mulling over the idea of a 5-year digital nomad visa for folks to be able to come there and live tax-free, some countries will give you 6 months, some countries give you a year, sometimes there's an extension. There are, I think, about 50 of these different things right now. And as always, the definitions are different. There are some that are basically glorified tourist visas that already existed. There are some that are brand new visa categories. So digital nomad visa, kind of like golden visa, kind of like any term that comes out that catches the public's imagination, is not always the same from country to country. So you want to understand what that means. But basically, it's permission that if you apply, and generally you need to show some kind of income, you need to show generally that your income is not coming from the country where you want to live, but it's giving you permission, it's giving you a visa to stay in that country 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is. And so therefore, rather than being the perpetual traveler that I originally was, where you may be limited to 30 days or 90 days or 120 days in a country, you can spend more time there. And therefore, you don't have to deal with some of the challenges that I faced, which is you've got to be super motivated, super organized, like super focused if you're going to be changing locations every 30 days. Especially in my opinion, if you're going to be staying in like Airbnbs or in hotels, there is an adaptation that you really have to work on if you're going to be moving from place to place. I don't even care if you're moving from one country to the country next door in the same time zone. That is difficult. And so the idea for a lot of folks who just want to get work done, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, one place, I'm going to set down roots, I'm going to get a lease, leave me alone. So the pros of a digital nomad visa. Number one is you're going to get access for a longer stay versus a tourist visa. The idea of visa runs, where you'll spend as much time as you can legally in a country, whether that's 90 days in Costa Rica, 30 days in Thailand, 180 days in Mexico, has largely changed since I've started this. Does it still exist? Sure, but what you've seen is you've seen countries like Thailand specifically say to their border officers, don't allow visa runs to the extent where people just constantly come and go. All right. Are there some countries where it's more flexible? Sure. Thailand in Southeast Asia is probably one of the less flexible places. Malaysia, perhaps, especially if you're Western, is maybe more flexible. But eventually you're going to be asked, like, what is it? Why are you coming for 88 days, leaving for a weekend and then coming back? Or, why are you even going somewhere for the same day and coming right back? I mean, I think a lot of countries have looked at, we don't want people to do that anymore. On the other hand, you see countries like Mexico, where it's 180 days visa-free. They've started asking people, even if you're American, even if you're Canadian, even if you're European, the countries where they've really never asked too many questions before, hey, when are you leaving? And if the answer is I'm leaving in 6 months, or I don't have a return ticket, or I'm just going to hang out, they're increasingly pushing back on that, especially if you're not a Westerner, but really even now for Westerners. And so I think there's a security, especially if you're trying to get work done and you want a certainty in your life of having some kind of status in a country, so that you're not biting your nails every time you go back to the country, like, are they going to let me in? Am I going to get the wrong person? And sometimes, by the way, it comes down to, like, are you wearing the right outfit? And we can talk about, men's issues versus women's issues versus the kind of country that you're in and all the different little rules. But, bottom line, I think having certainty is important. And so digital nomad visa, easy access for long stays. Now, there are some countries like Georgia, for example, Georgia being kind of the rare one, you get 1 year for most citizenships just on a tourist visa. And so they have a digital nomad visa, but, what's really the difference? Well, that's an example of like, what is really the difference? If you are an American, you can spend about the same amount of time in Albania, right? And so there are countries where you can spend longer amounts of time. But again, Mexico, the UK, two countries that on the tin say 180 days visa free. It's really not that easy. They're going to ask you questions. I mean, the UK more so. But the idea that you can just spend as much time with just no fixed plans and just hang out, they're going to ask you a lot of questions. And so the digital nomad visa bypasses all that questions. It gives you a certainty, and you can stay there for X amount of time and potentially with an extension. The other pro is lower requirements for residence or citizenship in some cases. So for example, if you want to come to Southeast Asia, Malaysia has a My Second Home program. It now requires you to spend 90 days per year in the country. Now you get up to 10 years, but you're spending 90 days per year. Theoretically, could you do it for a couple of years and then cancel, get your money out and go? Sure, there's not a huge fixed cost for it, but in the meantime, you'd be tying up 1 million ringgit, about 225,000 US dollars. You'd have to show about $9,000 per month in income. And okay, if you can meet the physical presence requirement because you want to be living in Malaysia, fantastic. But you're tying up a lot of capital to do it. Thailand has investor visas that are similarly priced, or they have an elite visa where you're just spending money from 15,000 on up for the privilege of living there. That works for a lot of folks. However, if you don't have that capital, or you don't want to deploy that capital, whether it's in the form of a fee, like in Thailand, or whether it's in the form of just parking capital at a high level, like in Malaysia, then a digital nomad visa makes that easier for you. Where I find that to be less appealing is, for example, Costa Rica's digital nomad visa is live. Costa Rica's requirement was always to show that you had $2,500 per month from certain sources, and if you can't do that, then you can just put $60,000 up right away. And so Costa Rica now saying, hey, our income requirements, which are pretty similar to our residence permit requirements, I don't really understand why you'd want the digital nomad visa, seeing that Costa Rica has a relatively favorable tax situation. It's not like the digital nomad visa reduces the tax burden, as Indonesia is talking about, where you get to basically skip the tax system on the digital nomad visa. Costa Rica's tax system already works for residence permit holders. And so you're really not getting anything extra, but you're fulfilling the same requirements. So if you want to go to a country, let's say in Europe, or let's say in Asia, where perhaps they don't have a clean residence permit regime unless you get a job, or the requirements for residence are too high. Let's say you go to Europe and you go to a country that the only thing they have is a golden visa. Latvia recently came out. And if you've got a Western passport, you can get a digital nomad visa in Latvia. Latvia has a residence by investment program. It requires 250,000 euros and up to be invested in the country, plus you have to pay some fees. And so the idea of just showing income obviously is a lot easier. However, you do have programs in countries like France, like Portugal, and others, where you can simply show income just to get a residence permit. And so again, what's the need for a digital nomad visa in that situation? So look at where the countries where you want to go to, and then compare what the requirements are just to simply get a residence permit, okay? Now, here's the third pro. Digital nomad visas, as I mentioned, what Indonesia's been talking about, may have some built-in buffers against tax, for example. Or if you're an employer, may have some built-in buffers against employment law, right? So if you're hiring remotely and you hire someone in Germany, for example, there are some conditions under which, even though your company is somewhere else, you could be sucked into the German labor law system. And so for everybody who's just like saying, hey, work wherever you want in the world, I think I hope that they have protocols in place and they've thought it through to understand the tax consequences of having people working in other countries and the labor law consequences. In many cases, digital nomad visas basically are saying you're bringing in your work from somewhere else, you have foreign income, has nothing to do with our country, you're living here just contributing to the economy. You're not like selling stuff here, you're not doing meetings here, you're not selling to our people. You're bringing in entirely foreign income, which you wouldn't bring in anyway, and so hey, we're happy to come and have you spend it, and it's basically just a big, long tourist visa. And so in some cases, what I'm seeing from people in the employment law field, not passing this along as legal advice by any means, but what I'm seeing is some of these digital nomad visas work as a shield where it's like, hey, you are working here of your own accord and you're not entitled to use like our court system, you're not entitled to the labor law provisions, you're just basically bringing in a job from somewhere else and leave us alone. And so that could have some tax benefits in terms of a country saying some of the digital nomad visas don't require you to pay tax. I'll get to in a moment, some do. But I think also there's maybe some flexibility on other elements of the structural employment side or the structural freelancer side. So those are three pros. It's easier, you can stay longer, potentially lower requirements, although not always, and there may be buffers against tax and other kind of legal situations. Now, let's get into the cons. Number one is some of the countries do have taxes in that if you become a tax resident of the country, there don't appear to be any provisions to stop you from just being a tax resident. And so there are numerous ways to be a tax resident depending on the country. If you look at a lot of developing countries, they'll have a pretty strict provision in just one regard. Strict as in only one way, which is you spend time, 183 days, 180 days, 181 days, whatever. That's it, right? And so more developed countries have often put in place protocols. Well, do you have a car? Do you have a house? Like, where are all your friends? Like, all kinds of different tests. And so in a case of, you want to look at a digital nomad visa and say, is there a built-in exemption from tax? Or is the country tax exempt in the first place? So if you don't have to pay taxes because there is no tax, or because you can qualify for some other foreign income exemption, which you may have to apply for separately, or because it's a territorial system where if you structure everything properly, like as long as you're not setting up local bank accounts, or as long as you're not remitting money, or as long as you're not earning money from local sources, then it could be exempt, then those countries should be fine. Territorial tax does have some carve-outs that you may have to worry about. If you're going to a country with a non-dom regime, that it still may require you to do some tax planning. So I think that if you're going to spend more than 6 months in a country, unless there's a built-in carve out where, hey, digital nomad visa holders don't pay tax, I would still do some investigation, because the argument is even if you're running a business that does business entirely overseas and that's foreign income, is your being there and managing or working in the business contributing to at least your salary being subject to tax or subjecting your business to tax? Now, again, some of the digital nomad visas, as in the pros, are building in buffers against that, but I don't think they all are. And so you want to know what are the tax consequences by and large of what you're getting into, and I don't believe that all of them have effectively handled that. Now, if you go and spend 3 months somewhere, then you'll probably be fine. I'm not giving you tax advice on that, but just the average person spending 3 months, that's basically a tourist visa. Why do you need the digital nomad visa? The other con is these are really not going to lead to citizenship. I've seen one example where they purported that it would lead to citizenship, but I don't see any basis for that. And so the idea is, let's take Costa Rica, for example. If you want to spend a number of years living in Costa Rica, even 1 or 2 years living in Costa Rica, sure, you can get the same tax benefits by living there on a digital nomad visa or just by getting a residence permit. The residence permit may take a little bit longer, but you still have the ability to live there while they're working on it, and if you do it properly, then it shouldn't take as long as some people talk about. The qualifications aren't really that much more difficult, if at all, for the residence permit than for the digital nomad visa. And so if you have the residence permit, you may go through a few more checks, but you're going to have the ability to start the clock ticking towards citizenship. And so it wouldn't be a bad thing if you're already thinking globally. Why not work towards a citizenship? And especially if you're going to spend some time in a country, okay, maybe you spend 2 years there and you decide it's not for you anymore, and you go back home and decide to start paying a ton of taxes again, or you just move on to the next place. At least you have the chance to qualify for citizenship, because it may take 5 years, 6 years, 7 years in some of these countries to be eligible for citizenship. Maybe you like the place, and wouldn't you hate to get in 2 or 3 years and say, wow, I'm loving it here. Oh, you know what? The digital nomad program doesn't exist anymore, and so now I've got to switch over, and I don't get to take credit for any of that time, right? So if you're gonna live somewhere, you might as well at least start qualifying for citizenship. By the way, even if you're Dutch or Singaporean or whatever, and you're not allowed to have dual citizenship, you never know when your country could change the laws. And so the ability to qualify after, for example, 5 years, maybe something's changed in 5 years. A number of countries are easing their dual citizenship restrictions, such as Germany and Africa. Liberia just did it, right? So you never know what will happen in 5 or 6 years when you're eligible. You might as well at least have that optionality, especially if it doesn't really come at any higher of a cost or any higher qualifications, okay? Another con is that the digital nomad visa may need to be renewed more frequently. Now again, there's so many different ones out there versus so many different residence permits. I don't know that digital nomad visas are that difficult, and some of them are just doing everything online. So, or it's just one quick visit. So I'm not trying to make it sound like it's that difficult. However, if it's a 6-month, that's going to be harder to renew than, let's say, Malaysia's my second home, where here you go, you're in for 10 years, and we'll see you then. You know, it's harder to renew something every 6 months than every 10 years. What happens, though, after the 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, whenever the extensions and the duration runs out, is there going to be a digital nomad visa? One thing we've seen, for example, in Estonia with the e-residence program, it opened to great fanfare, lots of infrastructure and companies were built around Estonian e-residence. It's the best thing since sliced bread. What was it? It wasn't a residence permit, it wasn't citizenship, it wasn't anything that people tried to make it out to be or misunderstood it to be. It was basically a form of ID where you could open companies in Estonia. Okay, it's a little bit easier, but quite frankly, it's not that hard from a paperwork standpoint to open companies in a lot of places. What's hard is the tax planning and all that. In Estonia, it was decent, but it wasn't great. But what people also thought it would do was help them open bank accounts. And then the banks just said, no, we don't want you. And so it became this much ballyhooed thing, and then it eventually fizzled out. Like other countries were talking about doing that kind of thing, and just you haven't seen it. So do I think remote work and people traveling and working is here to stay? Yeah, I do think some people are going to do it for a while and then just decide to go home. And so you'll see the numbers swell for a while and then come back down. Certainly you'll see always new people coming into the fray. But is the idea of digital nomad visas and the proliferation of them in all these countries going to continue? There are countries right now where people are upset that too many people are coming as tourists and driving up prices for locals. And so politically speaking, will some countries look at this as an easy thing to axe? Maybe. Now, this is all speculation, but the point is, what happens if the country where you're living in, number one, you want to continue living and not just go on to the next place? What if you want to keep living there and there is no more digital nomad program? Potentially you could get a residence permit, as is the case in Costa Rica, or most Latin American countries have, if you can show income, you can get a residence permit. But again, the point is, why wouldn't you just do that in the beginning? And so I see digital nomad visas kind of like Estonia's e-residence program, where they serve a purpose and they're very valuable. But I wonder if it's too much in the mushy middle, in some cases and for some people, between tourist visas and in between simple residence permits. There are some cases where they're valuable, where the residence permit qualifications require you to buy 6 figures of real estate or employ a bunch of people. I see the value there. But when it's in Latin America in particular, in parts of Southeast Asia, and anywhere we could get a longer term tourist visa, I don't really see the utility as much. The other con is that because of that, it's perhaps encourages transients, that if you're going to go through on some of the ones that don't offer you as much time, where it's 6 months or a year, again, is that really, are we deluding ourselves into thinking that that's more of a residence situation than it is? If you're moving every 6 months, like I talked to a friend once about what does it take to live, to say you lived in a country. I'm always talking to folks like, oh, I lived in Vietnam for a month. You visited Vietnam for a month. And so if the goal is like, I don't want to be transient, I want to stay somewhere and live somewhere and get work done, is 6 months long enough to do that before you potentially move on to the next place? And so that's the issue to me this is trying to solve. You can be the perpetual traveler and you can just go from country to country to country. You may not necessarily be able to get into the same country repeatedly for an entire 1, 2, 3 year stretch, but you can certainly go from place to place to place. I think what the digital nomad visa is designed to solve is to get people to stay in one place. And if the countries you want to stay in only offer you 6 or 12 months, then is that really a dramatic improvement over doing some visa runs? It does seem to me to be a little bit in the mushy middle compared to the fact that you're not getting necessarily tax benefits. In some cases you do. You're not getting citizenship benefits, not that every country you would live in, such as in Asia, for example, would give you citizenship in the meantime. But those are my thoughts. So if you have a digital nomad visa and you want to leave a comment below, I'd like to hear from you and what your experience is. Again, you want to compare digital nomad visa to residence permit and see if there's any benefit over getting the digital nomad visa versus just getting the full-fledged residence permit and having that greater level of certainty.